back in Blake's garage with an update. As you can see, we've got some more parts on here. As much as I like to think there's a ton of progress on all this stuff, this actually was off the previous build. So got my intercooler on, seems to fit in there just like it used to. The previous radiator setup, we've got some pushers, which Blake was talking about. Go ahead, Blake.
Yeah, so right now it's got a couple pushers on it. For anybody who's not familiar, so with the old setup that was on this car, the turbo sat just about touching the radiator. There was no clearance to it, so the car had pushers put on it by our friend Chris Beischer with a really slick disconnect setup and everything. But the problem with pushers is that you have these great big motors here, and they block airflow kind of naturally coming through the radiator. And they sit real tight against it. So basically you're relying on the fans at all time to cool the radiator. You can't just use normal static pressure while you're driving to move the air through the radiator. So what we'll probably do is pull these off, and we'll put a polar fan here. The nice thing about a polar fan is that when the fan, basically when you're traveling above about 30 miles an hour, you get more cooling from the airflow coming into the car, and we'll shroud this all and duct this all properly. But you get a lot more cooling from the air just pushing through the radiator from just airflow hitting the front of the car. So these essentially get in the way of that normally. So when you put a polar fan on it, the air can go through the radiator before it hits that fan, and that fan is gapped off. The actual blades are gapped about an inch off the radiator normally. So that's why you have all that shrouding. So we'll use probably either a Ford Taurus or a Volvo. I think it's an S40 or S60 fan. That's what I have on my Mustang, is the Volvo fan, and I have a Volvo relay setup that we'll use as well. They have a real slick 2-speed relay setup that's really nice. So we'll flip this over here because we should have more than enough clearance. I mean, figure your crank pulley's here, and there's really nothing in between these. So we have probably 6-8 inches of clearance here, and those fans are only about 4.5 inches thick. So
perfect.
We'll convert to that, and then this pipe here comes off. Again, it's a really slick setup that's bolted to it, but this was kept tight for clearance on the LS. So we'll probably pull this pipe off and change this design just a little bit. The cooling for this comes out kind of over here from the water pump. So we'll have to adjust that a little bit to clear the turbo and everything, but we'll basically run a pipe along here, and then this pipe should come back up to here, or this pipe should come up to here, and this is broke, but we'll just weld a new, weld a piece of cast on it.
Speaking of the water pump, do we have that one? We'll show.
I moved it.
Yeah, we did. In the back, in the back.
I put it away.
Blake was saying he noticed that this is the factory.
This is the pump. This is a 2JZ GTE pump, and we have a GE cylinder head. And those two things, I don't think, I grabbed extra parts. Those two things don't seem to get along. There's a fitting on the top of this here that I don't know what that's for, because I don't know anything about 2JZs, but it moves water somewhere. Looks like possibly a heater hose or something similar. But both of those, they hit the intake manifold, or they hit the exhaust manifold and the studs a lot. So that part doesn't fit. It looks like the front of the water pump's probably fine. The back housing here is just all kinds of wrong. And we're gonna want a heater system in the car, so I can't really, there's really no amount of relocation I can do on this back housing. So we'll have to go to a different back housing, which will probably just be a GE housing. I believe that the block is basically the same, like the exterior
They
block.
actually are. Yeah, as far as I've researched, the block is actually the same between the two. The biggest difference between the GTE and the GE block, as far as the engine goes, the oil squirters, and I think the GTE had some better internals too, but I gutted those anyway.
Yeah,
but the oil squirters I definitely wanted out of the GTE, the oiling system. So anyway, that was one of the things we're going to be swapping out for an upgraded part. So we'll just use a GE part, not upgrade I suppose, but just one that fits rather. To kind of recap on some progress that is made besides this front setup is in, and we're just kind of get some fitment in there, is it looks like Blake finished the actual motor mounts. I don't know if you've got a light, if we can see a little bit better here. But
we'll use a handy cell phone light because that's professional.
I apologize for the last video. I know it was under the car, and people mentioned that the lighting was terrible and couldn't see anything. But down there we've got one motor mount in, done, welded up. It looks great. And we're going to paint those before we
Yeah,
Or
since the motor's just a mock-up right now, this will all come apart, and there's obviously some surface rust from the steering stuff here too. We'll pull that apart and paint all that. And there's a little bit more bracing. The motor mount to the subframe here, it's just tacked in. I mean, I say tacked, it's got about a 3/4 of an inch of weld, but it's not finished. This will get fully welded down around the base of this, and then there'll actually be a bar that comes from this to, you can't see it real well, but there's a cross brace there in the subframe. So there'll be a crossbar that connects here. The passenger side already has that.
Okay.
So it'll essentially mimic the passenger side, and the passenger side motor mount basically looks just like the driver's side. Ignore the bolts sticking out. Those aren't obviously final. Those are just some random bolts I had that were the correct diameter. So
Sorry, I'm shaking the camera like mad.
we'll get some there. But you can see that the bracing in the subframe on this side, that'll be mirrored to the driver's side. So they'll basically just be the same both sides.
Okay, that looks good. And you started working down here on the intercooler piping, it looks like?
Yeah, so the nice thing is your setup before, it already had really 70% of what I needed here to get out. So it already came back up around underneath. There's a port here where you had your alcohol, methanol. And then I just shortened this a little bit and added this pipe here. I was actually working on getting a little bit more of it done, but I had some bad metal that didn't want to take well worth a darn. And,
Yeah.
well,
look at this
I'm
thing.
not great, but it was, there was some contamination in this pipe. It's some cheap Chinese pipe. And as I was coming around, it was welding fine, and it just picked up trash, and I got annoyed there and just melted it. That was me giving up on this section of pipe here. But it would weld fine for areas, and then it would just go to complete garbage. And the pipe was cleaned 3 or 4 times. It's cheap pipe, so we'll get a little bit nicer. It's not only cheap pipe, it's old pipe. I found it in a box.
Yeah, a lot of this build is going to be budget. There's going to be parts that we've already spent and other parts we will buy that are not going to be budget because they're the parts that we need to be reliable, need to be good. And other things like finding old pipe in a box that we're trying to use. Sure, why not
the
say,
elbows were fine.
But there'll be other stuff. We'll just, I know, one of the future things we'll be working on after today is we'll sit down and we'll figure out what kind of piping do we need rest for the cold side. I think order up some piping to finish the exhaust too, and we'll just...
Yeah, at least get it back to behind the transmission. I think that's going to be the next goal, is getting it out of the engine bay and getting it back past the transmission, back to about the axle.
Okay.
Which is enough to get us solid. We'll have a break point there with a V-band. That's most of the complexity, right? Putting a 4-inch over an F-body axle's not a new thing. That's been done plenty of times before.
Yeah.
So there's no magic there. Plus, we'll figure out we may need to do an oval over the axle. We'll have to measure that clearance because this does have a non-stock axle and things. So we'll measure that and see what we can fit, or if we need to split it into dual 3.5 or something.
Right. I'd like to keep it 4 as much as we can all the way back, and then the idea was to take 2 Borla 4-inch mufflers. They're the racing ones, and I'd throw out a part number, but I don't remember what it is. And then I'll go to the back of the car here, and I know we've talked about this, so you're on the same page with me, but I really don't want to do like something silly like a big old like 2J pipe out of the back. So I know half the exhaust is off right now, but there's another set that would go right there. But I would like to make that 4-inch go through the muffler and then into those exhausts, so I can retain the Borla looking exhaust on the back of the car and have that what it be finished up with. So
Yep. No, I don't think that'll be a big deal.
Yeah.
So
cool.
like I said, we have the oval that was previously here that starts amongst the pile of recycling. That starts right now. It necks down to what's that, a 3-inch at the back?
Yeah, it's a 3-inch at the back, and that went into the 3-inch and everything else. But yeah, I'd like to keep it 4-inch all the way back if we can on this. So we'll just pull this back to here, and we'll just put a 4-inch V-band right here. Perfect.
So this will get flipped for a driver, for a passenger side down pipe, because it was a driver's side down pipe.
Correct.
Before. So basically, I'll just cut and flip that, and then hopefully this will fit without too much adjustment.
Okay.
And then we'll put a 4-inch V-band on it, and that'll get it to a good solid start. I mean, honestly, it's enough to run and drive the car at that point. Mm-hmm. The turbo makes a pretty good muffler as is. So that'll get us the majority of the way there on the exhaust, and then we'll get a little bit of aluminum finish to charge pipes, and really get the intake manifold fabrication done.
Okay.
That's going to be
Yeah, well, I know
Most
I
complicated.
think we touched on the intake stuff in the last video, but just to kind of recap and talk about again, we were talking about just go ahead. We're going to make a cut right down kind of the middle.
So
and
where these studs sit and these little bumps here, I'm going to take the bandsaw and chop this here. So we're going to cut, it's a little more than 1.5 inches, about 1.75 inches off. And then what I'm going to do is CNC a plate out of 1/4 inch aluminum. That'll be about 4 inch, well, it'll be 4 inches tall. So it'll be a 4-inch CNC plate that'll get welded to this shorter intake manifold at that point. And then what we'll do is fabricate a plenum on that. And then that plenum will be internally reinforced with a few little pedestals essentially, so that we don't upset airflow too much, but it allows it to have a little more support, because when you're talking 30 plus pounds of boost, you need some support. You know, that's that boost is 30 psi, that's pounds per square inch, and you have a not insignificant amount of surface area in there. So
I'll probably end up pushing it to closer to 40.
Yeah, so lots of boost, lots of surface area, so it's important that we put lots of reinforcement in there.
Yep.
So that's going to be probably the last real major fabrication point on the car. The transmission mount, you can't really see it. We'll get video of that here at some point when I get the car up in the air on the lift. It's not on the lift at the moment, so. But next time we get the car up on the lift, I'll get some shots of that transmission mount. But it's basically just the BMR mount. It's just been really mildly modified to fit. But that's in place, the transmission. So again, the engine and transmission are sitting in final mounts. The subframe has been spaced down 3/16 of, or no.
Oh, yeah,
3/16 of an
You
inch.
probably won't be able to see that, but yeah, I can't really show it on anything. But yeah, we dropped it down enough. Now we have good clearance. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, we can close the hood, just prove that it fits. So our sweet custom broom-based prop. But
yeah,
that is hood clearance. With the radiator and cooling system and stuff in, you really can't much see
not
the
gonna
turbo.
be able to peek underneath there, unfortunately. But
Yeah, but there's a little more than 1/4 inch of clearance to the turbo, and the motor's not going to move 1/4 inch, so we have more than enough clearance. So, and the hood is it needs adjusted very slightly. It actually needs a bumper on this side.
yeah,
The bumpers aren't on it, so when you put a bumper on this side, it levels that side.
perfect.
So I did play with the hood latch adjustment a little bit to make sure that we were
Okay,
kind of dialed where it needs to be, and I make sure the door gaps and stuff are right, so we're all
perfect.
our clearances with the body panels in proper fitment. So we'll get a hood bumper on this side and that'll level her out.
Awesome. Yeah, again, this is a street car, and it's always been a street car. And underneath all the dust I have here, it actually is still pretty clean.
It's very
And I would like to keep it that way, even though I know most guys doing motor swaps like this are like, it's dented, it's scratched. Well, so are most 4th and F bodies, especially the LT ones like I have. But I'd like to keep it good looking if I can, and perform like it should, even with this new setup. So that's still kind of the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So said the last big step of fabrication is that intake manifold. Charge pipes are charge pipes. I mean, like I said, there's no magic to charge pipes. It's just fit where they fit, and one side's basically done. I've got 3 joints to add, and it'll be done, and then the other one will kind of snake around the opposite direction, which I can't finish that till the intake manifold's done anyway.
Okay.
And then we've got cooling pipes, which again is just going to be welding a couple cast elbows to the factory water pump and thermostat housings and such. And then we'll probably just fabricate some aluminum tubes. We'll use silicone couplers. We probably won't use radiator hoses. We'll use silicone couplers and aluminum tubes and couple those on the ends so that you have to put the silicone couplers on it to get the engine freedom for movement. But we can just build it out of aluminum tubing instead, so that we don't have to try to patch together radiator hoses. End up with a little bit simpler setup, easier to manage, and you don't have to try to find magic hoses that'll fit.
Okay.
So, and that also allows us to adapt sizes if we need to. We can do transitions in the hoses.
Absolutely.
With the aluminum. So, and then it's electrical system, fuel system.
Yeah, that'll be the next step in everything. So one other thing I was going to talk to you about was, and we already talked about this previously, I'm just bringing it up to the other people, or some of these connections we have with the intercooler. I know these are big problems, so when you start running a lot of boost, these always seem to pop off on cars. There is it's almost a V-band setup for it that you can do. So what are we going to use with that?
I call them Wigger clamps. So Wiggins clamps are the really nice aerospace clamps. Wigger clamps are generic wannabe ones that you buy on eBay for $50. There's a few different options in there. Vibrant makes a really, really nice set. Maybe they'd like to kick in a couple of them and we'd use those. But there's a few different companies that make them. But essentially it's a clamshell clamp. Most of them are at least inspired by the Wiggins clamps. I have Pegasus clamps on my Mustang. They work really well. We may not need to do them in all the places. One of the other options is to basically, there's a V-band on the turbo right now. So the turbo gets a V-band already. The compressor housing already has a V-band outlet. An option we can have to use these clamps here is essentially if we put a positive affixation here. So if we weld a bolt or a receiver for a bolt on both sides of this, you can run a clamp similar to what the diesels do.
Okay.
And you basically just run a bar across this. And that prevents it from being able to come free. Or if you positively affix it to the chassis somewhere here, basically you just prevent it from being able to come loose under boost. So we'll review that, and then we'll look at what we'll have as far as having if we need to do the Pegasus clamps.
Okay.
Now, the intake manifold to the throttle body, that will definitely get one, just like the turbo has one.
Okay.
And my intention will be to do that pipe in all one piece if we can make it come through everything.
Okay.
If it doesn't, we'll put a V-band in the center of that as well. So basically, if we have a silicone coupler, it'll only be on the intercooler side. The other side of it will be positively affixed with a Pegasus clamp or a V-band and all the other joints, which basically means if we don't have to put one here, we won't, and we'll just use some kind of positive affixation, whether it's a link bar between the two sides, or if it's bolted to the chassis,
okay,
so that it can't come clean. It adds, there's a little bit of play in the Pegasus clamps, but there's not much. These silicone couplers have a little bit more forgiveness in getting everything lined up. And when you do all V-bands or all really anything, you lose a little bit of the motor freedom for the movement of the motor. But B, it makes it a real pain in the butt when you ever have to service the car.
Oh, yeah.
Because the alignment, everything has to be so perfect.
Oh, yeah, I totally get that. I know from turbo experience for myself, other people with 2Js pushing at a lot of boost, it seems like they start running up boost, and then you see them like halfway down the track, like, oh, all of a sudden they're coasting, and like, yep, blew off another hose, blew off another clamp.
So we'll definitely have that addressed one way or another. Like I said, if there's a way to use some kind of bracketing to the chassis to hold these in place, because figure your intercooler is essentially rigidly mounted. It's on a part here that has a little bit of give. But as long as the tubing itself is positively mounted to the same part, which you can just do by, like I said, basically we can put a bracket here and bolt that to that tube. But as long as that tube cannot come free of where it's at, it will essentially, we get the same effect as having a positively affixed coupler without having to deal with the alignment of it.
Perfect. So. All right. One other thing we can talk about when it comes to that piping, I'll crack the hood back up here real quick. So just yes.
In the correct direction.
Handy dandy.
Adjustable broom handle.
Is we were going to try and run the charge piping right up through the factory cold air intake. Now the factory, the K&N cold air induction would always come right through here. I think even the factory one came through here on the LT1s. But if we can use this space to try and keep this space free, that would be...
Yeah, and if we look here with I'll grab a couple pieces of scrap here. So if we look, I mean, it's a 3-inch pipe, and you figure your throttle body is going to be around this area. So it really shouldn't be too difficult to get that through here pretty cleanly and keep plenty of clearance for everything else. So I'm trying to stay... We don't have accessories, and I don't know what the accessories look like on this motor yet. That's on our short list of things to pick up. But we have plenty of room to keep it clear of the hood and clear of the brake parts and clear of the accessories and feed it right in. Like I said, the real only question with this is going to be if we have to put some kind of brake in this piping. And like I said, we may, and if we do, we'll just put a V-band in the middle of there.
Perfect.
So just so that we can get it apart. I'm a big fan of making things very easy to service because I may end up having to help when we service it. So
that's very true.
always make it easy on the next guy because he's likely to be you.
Yep, those are true words spoken there for sure. Okay, so we kind of got a brief recap of what we've done so far to get to this point from the last episode that we shot. We talked about things that are coming up that we're going to work on next. What else do we have?
I think that's the majority of it. Like I said, once we get the next update, we should have some more charge pipe work and hopefully some of the downpipe exhaust work done. I do need to mount the waste gates.
Okay.
So that's on the short list as well. Those I had to wait on the motor mounts for that, and those are done. So the gates will be very soon after. There's really not much to do there. The Superstore manifold's pretty close. I think I'll have to shorten a pipe and add a pipe, and they're just going to get screamers. So there's really nothing.
And the waste gates, what are we using for those as far as?
We're going to reuse the ones you had.
Well, I know and I don't remember what size, but they're
They look like
they're JGS
38s, I think.
Yeah, they're pretty big. And we'll reuse those. I was more asking, are we going to use manifold pressure for them or?
We'll have to look and see. It's really going to depend on how much boost variance we need, essentially.
Yeah, I forget. Like some guys use atmosphere versus something else. I can't remember.
Yeah, it depends on where you're feeding pressure. I would expect, since we're probably going to need like 15 or 20 psi of spread between low boost and high boost, what we'll probably end up doing is doing a 4-port wastegate, which essentially means you feed the manifold pressure to the bottom normally like a normal wastegate, and you have the top of it essentially vented, so you vent the dome and feed underneath it for the wastegate. And then what the 4-port does is, as your boost comes up, it actually starts venting the lower portion of the gate, and it starts adding pressure to the dome on the gate. So you don't have as finite of control. So if you're only controlling the dome or the bottom, you can control your boost a little more fine-grained.
Okay.
But with that setup, if you're talking a 20 psi spread, you don't need to be able to control it by 0.8 or 1 psi. If you're doing it in 2 boost bumps that you bring your duty cycle up, it's fine. So because of the amount of spread and the amount of boost we're talking about here, we'll probably have to do that setup.
Okay.
There's always a little bit of trial and error to boost setups anyway. As far as the gate control goes, if we absolutely have to, we could put a little mini compressor on it and run essentially the equivalent of a CO2 setup, but with a compressor. To run positive pressure on the top of the dome.
Okay.
That's a lot more moving parts and complexity and stuff that you shouldn't need to do.
Trying to keep this as simple as possible, so hopefully we don't have to quite go to that, because it'd just be another. I got to find a place for the compressor, and
they're small, but it's complexity we shouldn't need to do.
Right.
There's plenty of people doing it using the manifold pressures in the correct application.
Okay.
My ARC-7, my LS1 ARC-7, I ran a 4-port, and I had a 2.3 psi spring in it, and I could run 19 pounds.
Okay.
And it was very linear and very easy to control. So this should be real similar.
Okay.
I don't expect a problem. So
great. All right. Well, there you have it. And stay tuned for more progress.